Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished colleagues. My name is Haida Bouza. I will be privileged to facilitate this important panel today. I'm the Regional Director for the Bureau of Arab States in UNDP. I would like to welcome you all to this high-level roundtable about deciphering the COVID-19 burden at a time when the mortality is growing in the poorer countries in the world. This event will explore the implication of a new research of UNDP on COVID-19 on the SDGs and implication for COVID-19 recovery and SDG progress in the decade of action. A year into the pandemic, this study finds that the long-term social and economic impacts of COVID-19 will unfortunately widen the gap between people living in rich countries and people living in poor countries. But it also finds that choices we make today can create a radically different future for all and for our children. And we have invited you all today to dive deeper into what it will take and how we can act on the different policy choices that are highlighted in this study. We have a very high-level panel today with us, interesting panel as well, including the permanent representative to the United Nations from the Republic of Korea, from Egypt and the Philippines, and the research director of the Stockholm Environment Institute. I will introduce you shortly. We also have my colleagues, and more importantly, our administrator, Mr. Achim Steiner, UNDP administrator, to whom I will soon hand over, and Laurel Patterson, who heads UNDP SDG integration team, and who have led this, the development of this important report. I'm also pleased to see many partners joining us, government partners, civil society, academia, think tanks, and the wider public from around the world. This session is being recorded as we speak and is shared on our YouTube channel, so you can share with your friends and colleagues if they are not with us today. And all findings are accessible on UNDP's COVID-19 Data Futures platform at data.undp.org, and where you can experiment with the scenarios presented in this study to inform policy advice, craft advocacy messages, and understand impact in your country or in your region. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to you, Mr. Achim Steiner, the UNDP administrator, for your opening remarks. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Khalida. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends. We all at the moment find ourselves in these virtual spaces trying to both reflect on what is happening around us and in some ways envisaging what could happen next. And I think the honest and harsh truth is none of us really know. We are living in desperate times. And to those of us who perhaps felt that the first wave of the so-called pandemic maybe affected some countries, would spare others, I've been brutally reminded just in the last few days again of how cruel, how brutal, and how powerful this virus is in essentially exploiting both our physical vulnerability, but also our social and economic vulnerabilities. And I think having the opportunity to reflect together with you on this new report, and let me be frank, it is, yes, just another report, but what it carries within it is both an acute sense of the risks that we face right now, but an equally important, not a sense of powerlessness, not a sense of fatalism, and not a sense of hopelessness, because right now that temptation is very prevalent in many of our communities and countries. Indeed, we see too many countries turning away from their neighbors and from the world at large because they believe that only within their own remit lies perhaps a way forward. And I think we all know, and we would not perhaps be in this session today if we actually understood very acutely of how risky this kind of thinking is, not only for dealing with the pandemic and the virus, but indeed with dealing with that tail that is getting ever longer and ever heavier in terms of the impact of this crisis on our communities, on our societies, on our jobs markets, and indeed on the prospect of recovery. I think I would also like to begin by saying that in the way that we have conceived the discussion for today, and that reflects also the approach of the report, is that in every crisis lies an opportunity. It may sound like just a prosaic statement, but it carries within it a very empowering message. We can choose different pathways forward, and they are significant in terms of their implications. Choices matter, to put it very simply, and no time is more acute and more focusing than perhaps finding ourselves in the midst of this pandemic, still raging across the world, with the prospects of tens of millions of people still falling into extreme poverty, and perhaps finding ourselves 9 years from now at the end of the period of the Sustainable Development Goals, actually in a place that is going to be worse. The default option indeed, and it should be a very sobering reminder of what is likely to happen if we do not act with different premise, with different paradigms and with different choices, then indeed the targets and indicators of the SDGs are literally being overrun by the impacts of the events that are playing out across the world right now. And let us also be very clear. Yes, there are wealthier nations that are able to buy themselves a degree of either time or opportunity to recover. But the scars of what is unfolding right now is playing out in rich and in poor countries, in developed economies or developing economies, in large countries and small countries. And I think we need to also recognize that this is a uniquely universal moment, because some of the countries who are faring the best under these trying circumstances are neither the wealthiest nor the largest countries. There are some very revealing moments that we are experiencing right now in the context of COVID-19 and the responses, where we suddenly begin to realize what it means to have a social contract that is alive between citizens among themselves, between citizens and the government, between the private sector, the economy and society, because actually the countries who are performing the best right now seem to be those where the system of governance actually is a unifying element rather than a dividing element of the public debate, where trust and confidence in state institutions, but also where states have confidence in their citizens, to put it very simply, is actually beginning to show that very different choices and ways forward are possible. Now, we have engaged in this research on international futures, on scenarios with the University of Denver and the Pardee Center already for a number of years. We have found it a profoundly helpful, insightful, and also methodologically very forward-looking partner with whom we try to bring to the abstract debate of policies and choices and development a degree of empirical evidence, but also a degree of methodological transparency, because to be very frank, any scenario is based on many assumptions and judgment calls, but it doesn't have to be a kind of fog in which we're moving. We can interrogate those assumptions, we can interrogate some of the judgment calls that we are making, and they become the basis upon which more informed, smarter choices perhaps become possible. At the core of this report, and I very much look forward also to our distinguished panel in a moment responding and commenting to this, and let me just briefly recognize them because they are truly outstanding colleagues and partners in not only this event, but indeed in the work of the UN development system, the United Nations, and that of UNDP. Our dear colleague, His Excellency Mohamed Edrees, the permanent representative of Egypt. His Excellency Mr. Hyun, the permanent representative of the Republic of Korea. Dr. Asa Persson, the research director and deputy director of the Stockholm Environment Institute. And of course, my colleague Khalida, with whom I already this morning was in another session and discussing an related element of this, which is the partnerships that we are seeking in trying to address this. Now, the international futures system that underpins the research that Laura will speak to in a moment provides us with, in some ways, a very simple set of scenarios, 3 scenarios, if you want, of which one I will briefly touch on, and Laura will no doubt explain the other 2. And the third one is an SDG push scenario, which in many ways ambitiously, but also unapologetically provides a set of assumptions and policy choices that could actually allow us to come out of this crisis, perhaps 9 years down the line, closer to achieving some of the SDGs than we were 15 months ago. Now, this is a very daring, and it should not be interpreted as a lightly made statement, nor is it ignorant of the extraordinary disruption and unraveling that we're experiencing right now. But as you will see from some of the analysis and some of the methodological work that has been done, it is not inconceivable that in a moment in which we have already seen, for example, digitalization accelerate by at least, I would say, 5 years from where we were before COVID-19, in the way that governments look at digitalization, in the way that we realize the urgency and importance, strategic importance of investing in connecting our schools and education systems to that emerging digital economy, in the way that financial resources have been mobilized, particularly in the wealthiest nations of the world, that would have been inconceivable as investment, public investment budgets that could transform our energy systems, drive an economy in terms of an accelerated green recovery, and also address issues of social exclusion. The fact that 50% of the world's population still lives without really any social protection. That so often in these original stabilization measures, we focus on the large corporations, when in fact in most of our countries, 90%, sometimes 95%, in Japan over 98% of businesses are in fact small, medium scale enterprises. They are the backbone of our employment markets, of our economies, of our communities. And the way that we will now make choices, invest these resources, also co-invest as an international community, because that is a critical fundamental assumption also at this moment, may very well enable us to take a very different trajectory forward. This is at the heart of this report and this analysis, which is trying to explore whether we are at a point where essentially we declare the Sustainable Development Goals redundant simply because they are unachievable, or we actually recognize them, first of all, as still an extremely valid compass, a unifying agenda amongst the very diverse nations of the world, but also tackling the very risks to our societal well-being, to human development, to sustainability that they intended to address with the measures that they have taken. The SDG Push Scenario is therefore a way in which we could conceive of and also conceptualize, because policymakers have to make very difficult choices now. They have to prioritize, they have to select, they have to sequence, and at the same time, they have to address multiple crises at once. We need to bring greater policy clarity into this space, not by having a universal recipe, but by helping countries to have access to and the means by which they can undertake this analysis, which is also why this work is so useful in terms of some of the databases that we are now making available to countries where different policy choices can be played out in terms of a scenario and an analysis of the impact on an individual economy. I see this as an example of the core purpose of having a United Nations Development Program. That yes, in a crisis, stands by countries in order to enable them to manage a crisis. But from the beginning, as you all know, we have been very persistent and insistent on always looking at the investments to manage the crisis already being the upfront investments also in a recovery. And this report, I think, provides us through a set of policy options, a significant degree of clarity, at least about where it is we have to make choices. That is the invitation for us to explore today, both the report, but also some of the bigger assumptions and perhaps some of the implications for this, including for international cooperation. We know that development cooperation, development aid, ODA, will not rescue the world overnight, but ODA, international co-investments right now, particularly for the more vulnerable and poorer nations, is fundamental to our ability to have choices. Where countries turn away from their commitments and where they begin to turn inwards, they are turning their back not only on a United Nations entity, a multilateral system, they're actually turning their backs on people to whom that is truly a lifeline right now. And our role as UNDP, as the UN family, the development system, is to provide the best possible information, analysis, and support to make that co-investment something that perhaps 9 years from now, when we look back, we can be extremely proud that we did not surrender to perhaps that reflex that would ultimately make us all into isolated islands in a sea of extraordinary despair right now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Administrator. Thank you for the ambition. It's clear that the future is in our hands and we can do it well, or hopefully not bad. With that, I think we are all eager to listen to Laura Patterson, who heads the UNDP SDG integration team, to present the main finding of the study. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Buzar, UNDP Administrator, Excellencies, colleagues, and friends. We're really delighted to share this report today and start to explore some of the data points and the details with you as a contribution to the discussion that will follow with our distinguished panelists. What motivated us to work on this report was something the administrator highlighted also in his opening remarks, is that if COVID is indeed an opportunity for change, if COVID, a threat, a crisis of this magnitude, is an opportunity to radically rethink and reset, what does it take? What does it mean to activate those changes? And how can we support countries? How can we work more strongly as a collective to create an evidence base that facilitates those changes that we want to see? Our approach was motivated by this, as well as by the need to design a study that would not sit on a shelf. We didn't want to design a study, particularly in an environment that's changing as fast as ours, that's practically obsolete as soon as it's written, even though for most of us, we're not receiving the written publications anymore. So what we wanted to do was create an approach that allows people, decision makers, our partners in countries, to explore the insights, to consider the different options, to interrogate alternatives, and use that as a way of designing choices. So this becomes less a study as much as it is a process, and we hope an accompaniment to decision makers in navigating what are extremely high levels of uncertainty that we're seeing and we expect to continue in the years ahead. The reason why futures modeling is particularly valuable here is because it allows decision makers to navigate these disruptions. It allows us to assess potential pathways for recovery, what their implications could be in the longer term. And what's different about future modeling, certainly the partnership that we have with the Pardee Center at University of Denver, is it allows us to look at the longer term implications and look at those implications across systems. So where shorter term projections can be quite valuable on particular sectors or a nexus potentially across a couple of goals, what this allows us to do is to take an integrative approach to our analysis and start to identify what are those leverage points, where are the choices that can have the biggest impact across the SDGs and towards the ambition of the 2030 agenda. The scenarios themselves the administrator has set out. I'll give you a sense of what this looks like in terms of poverty eradication and implications to 2050. And one of the important things for us in this report is not only to demonstrate the potential and the opportunities to 2030, but also to 2050, where we see significant acceleration, and you can see that in the SDG Push Scenario here as a result of those choices. As the administrator had mentioned, the SDG Push Scenario is made up of a series of integrated investments, integrated policy choices. And again, this is part of the reflection that there is no silver bullet. There is no one intervention or initiative that is going to solve the crisis that we're facing. What we have found is that when we model these 48 parameters together, largely focusing on issues of governance, digital disruption, social protection, and green economy, we start to see considerable benefits over the shorter term, but absolutely over the longer term towards 2030 and both 2050. So our first study was launched in December. And here we found that in the high damage scenario, a scenario in which recovery is protracted, debt levels are higher, inequalities are rising, the recovery is much, much slower. We could see over 1 billion people in poverty by 2030, and 250 million of those people would be in poverty as a direct result of COVID. Conversely, with the SDG Push investments, 146 million people could be lifted from extreme poverty by 2030. We took these insights and we looked further into the implications for those most at risk of being left behind. And this is part of our intention, certainly at UNDP, to ensure that in our work, we're reaching the furthest behind first. And so what we focused on in this second publication is the countries in the low and medium human development group and what the implications would be, what the opportunities are specific for their context and unique situations. And we found that in fact, the SDG Push scenario is incredibly valuable. The countries at the lower end of the human development spectrum could see a reduction in extreme poverty by 5%. And it's twice the level of reduction as those in medium HDI countries who also see a significant reduction in poverty. And there's a few notable examples. I will attempt to show you a little bit of what this looks like. It isn't so easy to see, but you get a sense of the scale in terms of the poverty reduction gains, particularly for those in the low income group, in the low HDI group. And similarly here, some of the significant gains that can be made for countries like Malawi and Timor-Leste. Another thing that we find through this study is that countries can gain years of progress. And we know that countries around the world have taken a significant hit in terms of human development gains that have been lost as a result of COVID. So we find that 16 countries could gain 5 years in their poverty reduction efforts, and all countries in the study could gain 11 years on average in poverty reduction by 2050. I will give you a sense of what that looks like. It isn't so easy to see, but it gives you the sense, and the study provides you with an opportunity to delve into this in more details. Which are the countries for which the years gained are the greatest? Which are the countries for which the years gained in the SDG push are the fewest? And how do we understand the conditions, the parameters, the contexts that are most critical for accelerating progress towards the SDG? Finally, the last insight that I wanted to share with you is around the countries that can achieve the SDGs by making the investments that are outlined in the SDG push scenario, which would not have been able to, particularly as a result of the implications of COVID. So we see many more countries that could meet the extreme poverty target, and considerably more you'll see in the second part of this slide by 2050, more countries that can eradicate malnutrition, and more countries that can achieve the safe water access target by 2030. And again, I'll just provide you with a snapshot of the data, which is giving you the sense of both the gains by 2030 and those by 2050. This for us is really the beginning of work which we have every intention of continuing with our colleagues in country, and we hope with the support of many of you in the audience today. All of the data from this survey, from this study, is available on our COVID-19 Data Futures platform. This allows you to compare different indicators that are most important for you, compare countries, look across regions in terms of the implications of these different scenarios. But it also allows you to download the data for analysis, which you may want to do specific to your context. Our intention is to deepen this work specifically with countries so that we are better targeting and tailoring to their needs. Our future research is going to focus more on the green recovery, which, as you saw, is a significant set of parameters in our SDG push scenario, but also on the gender dimensions of poverty. This sits in a space which is meant to be a thought experimentation and a co-creative space. Our intention for everything that we're doing in the Data Futures platform is to put these insights in your hands and create spaces and opportunities for you to consider the options and what the implications are, the choices that make the most sense for you. So in addition to this study, the space provides an opportunity to explore insights by pillar of COVID recovery, to consider what people are thinking, what's most important to individuals in different countries. And one of the ways that you can do that is by looking at the perception surveys, for which we have for the UN 75. Look at the really important considerations around our gendered response and the ways that that could impact recovery. Estimate, for example, what would it take? What would it cost? What is the fiscal space requirement to be able to enact measures related to temporary basic income, if perhaps you're looking particularly at the social protection dimensions of the SDG push scenario. This is a space that can be customized with you and by you, and we hope that this is also part of inviting you into a UNDP that is looking to scale our work on the SDGs, accelerate progress, increasingly be agile, and together navigate the uncertainties which we would only expect to continue and cascade in their impacts in the months and in the years ahead. You can find all of the details of the study also on our website, as well as the Data Futures platform. And I do want to recognize our tremendous collaboration with University of Denver and the Pardee team, whose names are here, as well as my team at UNDP, also reflected. Dr. Bazar, back over to you.
Thank you very much, Laura, for this exciting presentation. I'm sure that a lot of us will go immediately after this event to consult the platform. Let me now turn to the panelists. They are representative from countries, but also from organization, research, and those have taken keen interest in this study, and hence they are here. Let me start with the Ambassador Cho, who is the permanent representative of the Republic of Korea to the United Nations, and join Achim Steiner in thanking you for making this study possible through your long-standing partnership with the UNDP. This second flagship focuses particularly on countries where many people risk of being left behind. Mr. Ambassador, how do you see that the proposed policy interventions in the SDG Push Scenario can help the world deliver on the commitment of the 2030 agenda? Over to you, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Khalida. Let me begin by expressing my gratitude to Administrator Achim Steiner and his team. Mr. Achim Steiner, you have been demonstrating your leadership in this very difficult time. And as a result, the UNDP has come up with the work on this COVID-19's impact on SDG. And also, as you mentioned, the SDG Push Scenario, which seems to be a very good prioritization. But first, I must start with my confession. Confession that the early stage of COVID last year, I was conjecturing very poorly. When the lockdown began, I said to my colleagues that don't panic, this is a blackout for a short period of time. When the light comes back, we will recover normalcy. But I was wrong. And now I have so many concerns about the future. Although I got vaccinated twice, but I'm worried about variants and surges happening in different parts of the world and possible military conflicts that might come out of frustrations of people. But in the longer term, I'm worried about COVID-19's impact on the world, growing inequalities, the negative impact on SDGs, and so on. However, I remain optimistic. You might call me a Panglossian optimist, but I remain so. Some academics argue that through this difficult period, we human beings will emerge stronger than before, that is Homo Deus. But this is not the reason I am optimistic. The reason why I am optimistic is that I was able to witness sympathy, empathy, and compassion of the people. They take care of others. So you may call it a Homo empathius. For these reasons of empathy in human nature, I think the SDG push scenario is possible. However, I believe it can be realized only when we make three things as suggested in your report. First, we make wise policy choices. And secondly, we should make sound investment in domestically and internationally. Thirdly, countries all around the world should cooperate, working towards to the same direction. So now what is to be done? Cooperation, integration, and faith come to my mind. In the short term, first of all, we have to enhance cooperation for fighting against COVID-19. We have to focus on extinguishing this fire. This is a wildfire and not a fire across the river. We can be affected all, even though we get achievements of vaccination. Secondly, as the SDG Push Scenario suggests, integrated policies are very important and they are required. In Korea's case, President Moon Jae-in announced the Korean New Deal in the height of COVID-19 crisis last July. Well, it's very simple. Digital, we will go for digital and we will achieve greenness, and also we will go for a strong social safety net. As a result, we will have formulated policies focusing on investment in education and technology and infrastructure. With these concrete policies, I hope we will be able to seize this opportunity for coming back better. And I'm glad that our policy, this Korean New Deal, is well in line with the suggestions of your findings in your book. Finally, I suggest that we have more faith in what we do in the United Nations in general and the UNDP in specific. We should have more faith in UN system on integrated policy approaches. Well, with these, I mean, cooperation, integration, and faith, I hope we will not waste this opportunity as suggested by Achim Steiner. And we will seize this opportunity for making our global village fairer, more efficient, and freer than this COVID-19 crisis. All the best for the UNDP. Thank you.
Your Excellency, thank you for your inspiring word. It's clear that we need faith, integration, cooperation, and you have added the empathy dimension that we sometimes forget about. And thank you for your support to the UN reform at large. SDG acceleration needs to ensure we reach the first behind first. And this study that we have in front of you provided important insight, and equally important, it provides potential pathways and options, recognizing that COVID-19 impact will play out differently in different contexts. We have already witnessed that, each with their own challenges and possibilities, and I would like to add opportunities. I would like now to acknowledge and to specially thank His Excellency, Ambassador Manalo, the Ambassador of the Philippines. We know that Philippines is using advanced analytics and digital strategies to drive its recovery from COVID-19. So, Ambassador, from your point of view, what are the key considerations in COVID-19 recovery from the perspective of your esteemed countries, the Philippines?
Thank you very much. Certainly to say it's a great pleasure on my part to speak here this afternoon, and I would like also to thank Mr. Achim Steiner for his important remarks this morning, and of course your entire team for this very timely discussion. And also to congratulate UNDP's innovative research on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the SDGs and the concrete policy options that will be needed for SDG progress in the next decade. Well, as we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic, although essentially a health crisis, is adversely impacting all of us, particularly the poor and the most vulnerable, and coupled with the vaccine gap between the high-income countries and the low and middle-income countries, really leads to mounting concern And we think that this global vaccine inequity and gap needs to be addressed as a moral and development imperative. Otherwise, unless effectively addressed on an urgent basis, we will perhaps even witness further deterioration in our ability to meet our SDG goals. So I think this should go hand in hand, and this is also one aspect which the Philippines is very concerned with. Now, we note that the effects of the pandemic, including the measures to impact it, will, as the UNDP reveals, result in about 48 million people in poverty, perhaps by the end of the decade, by 2030, compared to what would have been the projection in a no-COVID scenario. Now, this long-term social impact of the COVID-19 pandemic will obviously further widen the gap between people living in the rich and the poor countries, and also the poverty gap. And so we are really, in our view, faced with enormous challenges. I won't really go into what the COVID has, or how the COVID has affected the socioeconomic conditions in the Philippines, but just very briefly, in a very general way, it has affected areas such as unemployment. Our GDP, which was originally 6%, which was a positive 6% in 2019, had fallen for the first time in 29 years last year to negative 9.5%. And particularly affected were also MSMEs, as well as agribusiness, and also tourism. And also Filipinos working overseas. We had to bring home about 300,000 Filipinos from abroad who lost their jobs as a result of the COVID pandemic. And in addition, there was also a drop in our remittances. So I'm using this as examples to show in a kind of snapshot the great effects that the pandemic has produced. And this in turn will affect the SDGs in the Philippines, implementation of the SDGs in the Philippines, especially SDGs 1, 2, 4, 8, and 10, due also to the sharp decline in purchasing power of many Filipinos. And this, of course, has led to hampering school activities, due also to the quarantine, job losses, affecting supply chains and logistics, etc., and also the ability to adapt to newer jobs and new normals, especially in those who lack perhaps sufficient technological skills. I think this picture, unfortunately, is maybe not only limited to the Philippines, but perhaps other countries face also similar issues and situations. So I think these are issues that we feel should be addressed in the coming days, and perhaps probably the main emphasis from now on, at least insofar as achieving the SDGs. Now, we have in many ways tried to address them in the Philippines by focusing more on recovery and resilience, looking at improving our health system, our food security and resilience, and also regional development and digital transformation. And we're also utilizing and recognizing that the interlinkages between the environment, natural resources, public health, and the economy need now to be put together and also dominate whatever approaches we have, so that we can really see how we can sustain and achieve a resilient and sustainable future. Nevertheless, we're also faced with finite resources, so we need to make urgent adjustments and decisions which will enable us to achieve many of these priorities and goals. So I thought I'd give this as kind of background to the challenges we're facing. And in this regard, and bearing in mind the fact that the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic is expected to widen further income and poverty gaps, we look very positively and with much interest at the recent UNDP research on the impact of COVID-19 on the SDGs, especially the proposition that countries can still reach their development trajectories and chart new development pathways despite the pandemic by making bold choices aligned with the SDGs, or what the research calls the SDG Push. We are quite attracted to this because we feel it is a principle which is a combination, which combines a policy choices and investments in government, social protection, green economy, and digitalization. And this happens also to align now with our country's current development priorities. But we think this is a useful approach, and basically states that much will depend also on our policy and investment decisions that we make today. So I think this is something where we are very much attracted to and are looking forward to working with UNDP in this aspect. Now, I just want to finally some final words just to say that, of course, the Philippines remains committed to international cooperation in achieving the SDGs. And we wish to also state that we continue to significantly contribute to the recovery of other countries through our migrant medical frontliners and our migrant workers, and also through our support for the COVAX facility and the COVAX Advanced Market Commitment. I think these are important elements too in any effort to try and, at least at this stage, to enable us to try and reach our SDG goals. And we also continue to feel the important, we also continue to strongly advocate the important role of migrant workers in the COVID-19 response and recovery effort of receiving countries. Further, the impact of the pandemic is also, since it's been universal, and the traditional relationship in terms of development cooperation, therefore, has had to change a bit. And per capita income-based development and financing frameworks need to be overhauled in a way that many developing or middle-income developing countries need support and that they should not be excluded. So, so we urge our colleagues in all these efforts to work together, and certainly the UNDP, which the Philippines has had a very long history of cooperation. I think we will even be more inclined to work hand in hand with UNDP in reaching these objectives and goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for your inspiring words. Obviously, we all realize that the decision of today will influence if we have a resilient and sustainable future for all. In July this year, we know that the world will gather for its annual review of the SDGs at the High-Level Political Forum. Countries are presenting their voluntary national review, including challenges and opportunities around SDG implementation. Egypt is one of them, so we are lucky to have the Ambassador Edrees with us today. So, Ambassador, can you tell us how can this study and the system approach be helpful to countries, including your own esteemed countries, as they seek to build forward better for COVID-19? Over to you, سعادة السفير.
شكرا جزيلا دكتورة خالدة العزيزة. Thank you very much, dear Dr. Khalda, and allow me at the outset to express my appreciation for the invitation to join you today in this high-level roundtable, and to express appreciation for the opening remarks of distinguished administrator, Mr. Achim Steiner, and the presentation by Ms. Laurel, and for the presentations made by my dear colleagues, Ambassador Cho and Ambassador Manalo. Let me say that, of course, the world has witnessed unprecedented challenges as a result of the negative repercussions of the COVID-19 pandemic that affected all our economic and social activities, including our joint efforts towards achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. These repercussions present a great threat to the gains we have achieved in recent years in terms of economic growth and poverty eradication in the world. And the developing countries in particular have suffered the most from these emerging challenges, which requires us to mobilize all efforts to face these profound negative repercussions. If we analyze the report at hand, we will definitely realize that the global crises caused by the pandemic can compromise the world commitment to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. According to the report, 41 to 169 million individuals could be directly pushed to poverty, while 60.5 million will increase the number of people suffering from malnutrition. The implications of the COVID-19 pandemic has affected several other aspects that include the fiscal and monetary strength of developing countries, especially middle-income countries, and halted several national projects and economic reform plans. And above all, the pandemic has put more stress on fiscal and financial status of the developing countries, putting debt sustainability at risk. It's now more than any other time that we need to collaborate. Right now, our observations reveal that the overarching aim, leave no one behind, is threatened seriously by the current growing inequalities. Yet, we firmly believe in the principle of building back better while also leaving no one behind. Excellencies, despite the severe magnitude of the negative implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have an opportunity to recover back better. We are given the opportunity to revise policies and formulate new strategies with focus on strengthening our multilateralism, while also paying special attention to the needs of each country. The report at hand presents some important solutions on the way forward to recover back better. The proposed SDG Push Scenario, which examines the benefit of concrete options across governance, social protection, green economy, and digitalization, would indeed reduce the number of people living in extreme poverty, while also address the challenges of ending hunger and addressing malnutrition. A global emergency such as the pandemic requires a global solution. That solution should be comprehensive and multidimensional to support the developing countries to get back on track in achieving the SDGs. This should include debt relief, provide developing countries, especially African countries, with the necessary tools of digital technologies, as well as prepare countries, sectors, and individuals for a new economic landscape. Provision of finance remains a crucial issue for developing countries to recover back better and focus on a greener recovery. Financing is key for developing countries. For example, the ongoing financial gap, especially delivering the 100 billion climate finance commitment, remains a challenge. We see this as an essential tool for the developing countries in order to join efforts to combat the implications of climate change and recover back better. Egypt is committed to achieving the SDGs and has incorporated this commitment in our national strategy, which is named Egypt Vision 2030. Despite the socioeconomic challenges resulted by the COVID-19 pandemic, Egypt will present its third BNR at the HLPF, scheduled to take place in July 2021. In this connection, we have exerted continuous efforts since the beginning of the pandemic to respond to the health implications of the pandemic, while also addressing the new challenges resulting from this pandemic. We have undertaken several measures, among them the following. One, a stimulus plan totaling $6.3 billion was implemented to mitigate the implications of the pandemic. Second, central bank's allocation of $1.2 billion to support the country's stock exchange. Third, enhancing social protection by extending the coverage of existing schemes, such as the social scheme called Dignity and Solidarity Initiative, including cash transfers, food aid, unemployment benefits. The initiative covers about 100,000 families. The grant of an immediate financing for the import of key commodities. And lastly, artificial intelligence tools are being applied to help in the improvement of performance of government agencies. The aforementioned measures, along with the commitment to achieve the SDGs, help in mitigating some of the implications of the pandemic, while also contributing to the achievement of the SDGs. It is expected that the GDP growth in Egypt would reach 5% growth mark in 2023. And this was sharing experience of Egypt as one of the middle income countries in the midst of these grave implications of the COVID-19 pandemic. Excellency, to conclude, allow me at the end of this intervention to reaffirm our commitment to achieving the SDGs, as well as stress on the importance of international cooperation in order to successfully do so. And let me, of course, highlight the important role the UNDP is doing since the beginning of this crisis, and the support is given to our countries to face the multidimensional implications of the COVID-19 crisis. Thank you very much, and really has been a pleasure being with you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. It's impressive the efforts made by Egypt to support the population in this pandemic. I'm sorry, the last speaker before the conclusion is Dr. Person. You will have to be shorter. I'm sorry, I will not give justice to all your work. Dr. Person represents the research sector. So tell us, from your perspective, what will it take for countries and practitioners to break out silos and really tackle systems and root causes to deep-seated development challenges?
Thank you, Dr. Buzar. Excellencies, Mr. Administrator, dear colleagues and friends, thank you for inviting me to share a perspective from the science and knowledge community around the SDGs. And I also want to congratulate UNDP and the Pardee Center for International Futures on this timely, important and thought-provoking study. So I think the primary goal here should of course be the relevance and usefulness of these scenarios to countries in their national policy making and planning to overcome some of these challenges that the previous speakers described. So I wanted to complement this by offering some reflections on what I think could be some scientific implications and future research needs. On the whole, I think the COVID pandemic is a stress test of Agenda 2030. We can come out of that worse off, business as usual, or preparing the ground for this SDG push. Regardless of how we do on the goals, my hope is that the scientific engagement with the SDGs will come out of this crisis being more practical and being more accountable. And I have 3 takeaways from this report that might help us get there. First, on using time as a key metric, and I think this is very interesting with the report we heard about. Discussing SDG progress in terms of years, either losing years or gaining years, as done in this report. It's effective, it's elucidating, and I think the risk of losing 11 years of progress if we don't undertake this SDG push is simply unacceptable. No CEO or leader would be re-elected if such an opportunity was missed and a 11-year delay was at stake. With the effective organization of the youth movement around the world, the future has come closer, and 11 years have a very tangible meaning for many people. So what's clear from science, not least climate science, is that in the 2020s, time is our scarcest resource. And there's a need to reimagine how quickly we can move from ideas to action. So what I think we can do in science is to be clearer on the time perspective when looking at solutions and policy options for the SDGs. How can we sequence solutions? What are the quick starts? Where can we expect time lags, etc.? So I hope that also the next UN Global Sustainable Development Report, which I am part of drafting, that we will continue to use this perspective, use time and years as a central metric when measuring progress or regress on the SDGs. A second takeaway for me is the unpacking the SDG push or SDG levers. If we unpack it, this push as described in this report, is quite clear that the SDGs are not really a magic new wand that offer new and easy solutions and silver bullets. To me, it's a very powerful commitment to building a solid foundation for development really working through the basics. So some of those indicators that Ms. Patterson showed us were really about good governance, public sector capacity, social protection, enforcement of environmental legislation, ensuring fiscal space. In another recent UNDP report prepared by Mariana Mazzucato and others, I think the focus is rightly centered on public sector capacity. The authors there find that one of the biggest lessons from the pandemic is that public sector capabilities to manage a crisis of this proportion are dependent on the cumulative investments that the state has made in its capacities to govern and manage. The takeaway for science here, I think, is to more directly connect our work, our research, to public sector capabilities in low and middle income countries and be part of that cumulative investment. What we've seen in our work at the Stockholm Environment Institute is that serious buy-in at the sector level is really needed to truly mainstream the SDGs and to match them with sectoral investment plans. So I think now we have an opportunity to not just do in and out scientific studies, but really to try and embed scientists in public sector, in government, doing secondments, understanding not just in theory the interactions between SDGs, but the real choices and dilemmas that countries are facing. Building that clarity in the policy space that the administrator described, and developing practical rather than optimal solutions. And this brings me to my third and final reflection, I think, which is the need to make the decade of action also a decade of accountability. So what I mean here is that we need not only to take action, but to take the right action and the most priority action, and being accountable for those actions to end users. The science community was very quick to internalize the SDG agenda. Actually, more than 20,000 scientific papers have been published on the SDGs since 2015. I think it's now time to move beyond that initial sense-making, mapping the SDGs to existing institutions, processes, looking at these interactions in theoretical terms and visualizing them nicely. So I'll stick my neck out as a scientist here and say that at the moment, maybe we don't need many more papers, but really try to find ways to do more needs-based science, and again, get into that policy space, which is so crucial now. So to finish off, thanks again to UNDP and the researchers involved in this important report, which I think and hope will help the scientific community to be more practical and accountable in its contribution to the SDGs. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You were the last speaker, but not the least. I tell you, I'm a scientific myself. Thank you for your word for the practicality and accountability. This is very important. I would like now to hand over to Achim for his closing remark. Our thanks to all the panelists. It was very interesting, and specific thanks to the Republic of Korea for being our main partner for this initiative. Achim, the challenge is to close quickly. Over to you.
In 30 seconds, a deep thank you to our ambassadors, also to ASA. Thank you very much for joining us and providing that reality check, that triangulation. Thank you for your reference to Mariana Mazzucato's work also. In fact, we have just produced a joint report with her institute also, because it is precisely in the envisaging of government and the role of state institutions as capable of transformative action, of mission-led and purpose-led responses in the midst of a crisis, that, you know, we don't want to signal that government is the solution to everything, but we have seen in this COVID crisis that without government, a society is truly rudderless. It lacks the institutions, including the democratic institutions, to arrive at consensual priority setting. And so that work that we also do with Mariana Mazzucato and her team is part of the reconceptualization of how UNDP can best support countries making their choices. And I just end by thanking Laurel, her team, our partners in the world of academia, the University of Denver also, and the many practitioners who contributed to this. The UNDP Future Data platform that Laurel referred to is really the next stop, I hope, for many of you, because it is here that you can immediately take something that is at the moment at the level of meta description, global analysis, and landed in real life, real geography contexts where ultimately choices are made and will make a difference. Thank you so much to our panelists. Khalida, thank you, and back to you for closing us down.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think I had nothing to add more than please go and visit the Data Future platform on data.undp.org. You can play with the different scenarios, and I think you have a nice day. Bye.